Session for the Annapolis City Council on Thursday, October 20th, 2022 will be called to order at 3 p.m. At this time, would everyone willing and able please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic which stands one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Mr. Assistant City Attorney, please present the first item.
The first item on the agenda is ID 11322.
Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you.
Great to see you guys. Thank you for all your hard work. Thank you.
Should we begin?
Please.
Okay. Thank you. My name is Jared Littman. I am the Ward 5 representative and the chair of the Annapolis Ward Boundaries Redistricting Task Force. It's not a committee, it's a task force. And I am with my vice chair from Ward 7, Marianne Arnett. Emma Smith is behind me from Ward 1. Brandon's not available today, and Lisa is not. Solon is not. And Solon's coming in now.
Right on cue.
We have Greg Brennan from Ward 6. And Michael Matthews is not able to be here, and we have Harold Lloyd, who is our at-large member. Before I go further, I want to make sure I don't forget to thank Sean Wampler. She's been our GIS coordinator, and Eric Lashinsky from Chief of Comprehensive Planning has been very helpful. Ayatollah Ajay, I'm never sure if I say his last name correctly, and Laura Gutierrez, who I was expecting to be here and may join us momentarily. I haven't seen her yet, but she's got a piece coming up soon, so I expect her. If I can go to slide 2, please. We're here to present the work that we did. And before presenting the work, I want to highlight the fact that you guys all got an initial report last April from us. There have been a couple small spelling corrections since then. I believe with Hillary out, I'm not sure that you've actually seen it since April or you've seen the final version. So we're going to try to do an overview, and we'll refer you to certain parts of the report as we go along. So why are we here? The issue presented is from the 2020 census, which counts where people are during the census as opposed to where they were in 2010. And in that 10-year difference, the population increased by over 6%. Interestingly to me, every ward actually increased, but not in equal amounts, of course. If you add up all those totals, and this is a number you're going to want to write down, if you got a pen and paper, write this number down I'm about to say. If you add up that total and you divide it by 8, an exact average will be 5,119. And if you don't want to write it down, believe me, that number's in the report a couple times. So in an ideal world, theoretically, for some ideals, if each ward had exactly 5,119 people, you would all be equal. In particular, as you see from those numbers, if you don't have this in front of you, but you might want to make a couple notes to yourself or just kind of observe what I'm about to tell you. The total in the middle column shows you the total population. The deviation doesn't show plus or minus, so we're going to highlight that right now real quick. You'll see Ward 1 has a negative deviation of 2.77. Ward 2 is the largest ward, and that's plus 6.29%. I'm going to start rounding. Ward 3 is one of the closer ones to the middle at 2%. Ward 4 is a little larger at 3.8%, and Ward 5 is a little larger than average at 3.5%, 3.4%. Ward 6 is a little smaller than average at 2.75, and Ward 7 is the smallest, and we're getting close to what we're talking about in a minute, negative 8.3, and Ward 8 is close to the average, but a little smaller than the average by 2%. So Ward 2 grew by 13%, and Ward 7 grew, but less than 1%. And like I said, there's equal distribution is ideal. It's not needed. You need to be close, and we'll hone in on that as we get further in the presentation. Giving you some more numbers you might want to write down, but you'll see it in the report. Ward 2 has 66 more people than allowed, but over 300 more than the average. Ward 7 has 171 fewer people than allowed, but over 400 fewer than average. So Facing that dilemma of how to get to closer to average, the City Council formed this task force to recommend a new boundary ward map to address the population growth and shifts within legal and practical limitations, which we'll talk about in a second. Page 3, please. So the report that you got back in April, and hopefully you'll get again soon, more or less follows this outline. And I'm just going to really quickly highlight what's contained in that report. Of course, there's an executive summary. There's a legal framework, which we had the fortune to be able to work with the Honorable Jarashow, who was working on the 2010 task force, then it was a committee, and he helped us with the legal framework, and it has not changed materially since then. We're then going to present to you Map C, which received a majority and a bare majority of 5 out of 9 votes. We're then going to present to you the minority supported, which received 4 out of the 9 votes, and you can see that's Map C and 3C. We're going to briefly discuss maps A and B, and those are the report. Those are maps along with map C that was presented for one of the public hearings, and you'll hear why we discarded maps A and B. And I will then quickly go through our effort to achieve a 422 map, and I'll explain what that is later. Some of you, and Ross, I'm talking about you, you're going to want to go through the demographics because there's a lot of numbers in there that I think you'll find interesting. Others may as well. Among the demographics that you'll see, if you made no changes, and that's as of today, there are no changes made, there is one ward that from 2010 to 2013 changed from a plurality, not a majority, but a plurality majority African American to plurality of Hispanic. And I'm looking at Rhonda because, of course, that's Ward 3. And you'll see a lot of other interesting demographics and charts I think you'll find interesting. Then I also really wanted to highlight, we took this very seriously. We had a ton of meetings among ourselves. We had a couple public hearings. We received written comments. We received petitions. We used lots of Sean's time, and so those are all the minutes. They're substantial minutes. You might want to be interested to see what your citizens and your constituents said during the course of our work. And then in the appendices, you'll see Eric Lashinsky's report, Laura's report, and then some of the written testimony and citizen petition. Without changing the slide, I'll now start to dive into the executive summary. And I'm going to go through this at a high level to not get bogged down. First thing that we had to do before we could start answering the question is understand what our parameters were. And so we got involved, we reviewed thoroughly what the legal parameters were, and I'll get into more of those details. But beyond the legal parameters, there is a lot of practical limitations to our work. In an ideal world, not in an ideal one, if it was simple, all you would have to do is take the certain number of people that we were over in Ward 2 and add them towards 7, and your work would be done. You have a couple limitations. Obviously, those are not connected wards, so you have to have more of a trickle down. You have to take people out of Ward 2 and move them down the various wards until you get to Ward 7. You also have to do it not by households or by people, but by federally defined, delineated blocks. And the blocks became a big pain in the neck because some blocks have 11 people, and that was great because when they're small, you can move small little chunks. Some blocks have 1,000 people, 15,000 people. And you can't easily move, when you're talking about 5,000 as the average, you move 1,500 people and you're out drastically changing things. So it's somewhat of to us, it felt like an artificial barrier, but to you, it's gonna be a very real barrier to really mess with what we present to you, frankly. So that's a very real limitation. You also have to be limited, and this might sound obvious, but the city boundaries. And in one particular instance, there's a road right between the Crystal Spring area of Ward 4 to the Hunt Meadow area of Ward 5. You have Spa Road going through, connecting to the school. Well, because it's the county road there, it's not considered contiguous across the street. So you couldn't connect Crystal Spring to Hunt Meadow through that area. You'd have to go the other route and around the whole area, which you can do. But again, you have some arguably, you have these barriers to do what could be an easier job. You also want to keep communities intact, and that's mostly what we heard during the public comments, and I'm sure that you've heard from your constituents to the extent that you've been able to engage on this topic. And we'll get into some of those specifics in a minute. I also want to highlight the timing of this. No matter what changes you make, it won't affect anyone in their chairs today in this term, and that includes if there happened to be a special election. It's the I forget where it comes from, whether it's the city code or elsewhere, but these changes won't go into effect until the next citywide elections. And truly by coincidence, I don't think it changed where you would sit. So I think all of the current elected officials still live in the ward. That didn't change, but that wasn't a goal of ours. I think it just happened to be the case. Two questions that came up related to each other that came up frequently, so I'll try to address the questions before you ask them. The populations of people that we're talking about, they are the populations that existed as of the census. So it's not if there was a development that got approved from then till now or tomorrow, and those people are about to move in, those people are not counted for purposes of where you move things around. Specifically, that's for reaching the limitation of getting equal. And I say that carefully because if there's a development that's about to open, and Rob's got a couple in Ward 7, you all, frankly, I've got maps. You've all got developments happening in almost every ward, except for maybe Ward 5, I think. You can factor that in to justify maybe Ward 7 being a little smaller going forward, but it still has to be within 5% of the average as of the census. So you could factor it in a little bit, but you mostly have to ignore all future development, future as of the census. And it's people, it's not necessarily citizens or anything like that, because that's what the census is. Okay, so now that we have all the rules and parameters, we can start to answer the question presented. And like I said, we tried to minimize the communities that were left intact. To give you a sort of a warning, these communities kept on coming up over and over about being intact, being split up in some way. And those are Clay Street, Germantown, Truxton Heights, Bates, and Eastport Terrace and Harbor House. And if you think about it, it sounds logical, and that's because those are all the communities that are on the borders of wards. If you're a community right in the middle of a ward, we weren't really worried about you because we need to move along the edges. And so those are all the border neighborhoods. If we can go to slide 4, please. This is ultimately the map that we are recommending. The majority recommended, 5 votes. And the main benefits, and Harold will talk about getting into this more deeply, there's, relatively speaking, compared to the maps we looked at, relatively less movement with this proposal than others. There's fewer communities that are disturbed in terms of being split up, although Germantown does end up getting chopped up pretty significantly. That's probably the one that gets hit the most. You'll notice Bay Ridge Gardens on the bottom gets moved. It's also in compliance. So it meets the legal goals. We believe that it would pass the legal test, which you'll see is referred to as the Jingles test. We'll talk about that in more detail later. As opposed to, if I can move to the next slide, please. This is map 3C. This is, you could argue, more compact as a final result, and we'll get into what the hash marked areas. The hash marked areas are the parts that are getting moved, and we'll dive into that more deeply shortly. So there's more movement here. It's also more compact, and it also splits off different communities. So Germantown in this one gets altered very minimally and along West Street, but then you have significant movement right in the middle of the map along Hilltop, and that community gets split up somewhat along Hilltop. And then Bates gets separated from Ward 4, so this has a lot more moving pieces. And again, this is the minority map. Before we move on further, just a couple more of the demographics points. Between 2010 and 2020, the white population and the black population decreased by 13% and 12% respectively, while the Hispanic population increased by 45%. There's an asterisk on this in the notes in the report, and that's because the 2010 census, frankly, sure. White and black decreased by 13% and 12%. Hispanic increased by 45%. The asterisk is it might not have quite increased by 45%. They might have just gotten better about counting the Hispanic population. In the 2010 census, a lot of the Hispanic communities were in the other category, whereas by the time they got to the 2020, they had a better job of counting and putting them in Hispanic. So the growth is certainly significant. Whether it's exactly 45% or if maybe they did a better job in 2010, it might not have been quite as high as 45%. It at least directionally shows you the change. And I mentioned from Ward 3 went from a plurality of blacks to Hispanics in that time frame without making any changes.
You realize that we don't have copies of this, right?
Yep. And-
So if
yeah.
we're talking about these, we can't see specifically. So will we get a copy of?
You were supposed to have that today, and I can't explain why you don't.
Okay.
And you were supposed to have it in your book, and I can't explain why you don't.
But we will get a copy.
Absolutely. Yep.
Okay, including your remarks with the percentages and all of that?
Yeah, that's all in the report.
Okay, great.
It's all important.
Thank you.
Okay. In both maps C and 3C that we're presenting to you as the two maps that had the votes of this task force, Ward 6 would also go from a plurality of blacks to Hispanics. So you can see definitely a shift of populations. If we can get to the next slide, slide 6, Laura was going to, I'm sorry. Laura, are you here, by the way? Yep, thank you. Good, so that's coming up in the next slide. This is a slide from Eric Lashinsky's, and I know it's small. You have this, you have not only this one, you have his full report in the appendix, like I mentioned. This is to give you a sense of all those yellow dots are finalized residential permits, where people moved, were approved to build between 2010 and 2020. And you can see there's a lot, and that's hopefully explains some of the population shifts that we already discussed. If you look into his full report in the appendix, I think you'll get a little bit more of a grasp of those new homes and what's the future, what does the future hold as far as where the next set of new developments will be. And so I encourage you to go to the appendix if you find that interesting. And for slides 7 through 10, I'll ask Laura to join us and walk us through her input, a summary of her input, I should say.
Yep, thank you.
Okay.
Sure.
All right. So I was asked to speak on the impact on Latino communities on redistricting. And I did this in my capacity as a Hispanic Community Services Specialist, but since I'm still here, I will continue to speak on it. Next slide. So just to sort of go over the numbers of the Annapolis population, you guys know that the Hispanic population, according to the census, is 22.7%. And in the county, it's 6 to almost 10% change this year. This census year. Next. One of the things to keep in mind when looking at that number is that there's this asterisk right next to the number, and that basically tells you there's a whole lot of misrepresentation here, and that there's a lot of different issues that we need to be considering. One is that a lot of people don't self-identify as Hispanic Latino, having been born here. Another is that there is the fear or mistrust factor, that they're unaware of the census and that they don't reply to the census, and that they're working when the census folks do come down knocking on doors. So that number is usually underrepresented, especially with the undocumented Latinos living here. And in Annapolis, we do have a significant undocumented population. So a lot of people think of this number as underrepresented, that it's probably closer to a quarter of the population in the city. Next. So basically the main thing that I recommended and shared was that we should probably be looking at ways that, that we can keep harmony in our communities, but also that we are equitable and inclusive when looking and drawing lines for both our Black and Brown communities, and that we try to create more minority majorities in our wards so that we can have more representation of both communities. So that was sort of the gist of the report I gave. I think that's it. Mm-hmm.
Before I go on, I realize I forgot to also thank Hillary Raftovich, if I finally say her name correctly. She was also very helpful, of course. And I neglected to mention her name when I thanked other people in the beginning. For the next slide, I'm not going to ask you to read that from the screen, and I'm not going to read it for you here. Trust me, it's in the report that I assure you, I'm sure you will get at some point. I'm going to just highlight a couple of the key elements from the legal framework. Again, we're supposed to have substantially equal population among districts. Each ward has to be have adjoining territory, and so you need to maintain contiguity. Each ward should be compact in form. Each ward should protect communities of interest, and it should keep communities intact. Although the big asterisk to all that is number 4, preserving the status quo may justify digressing from the generally recognized redistricting criteria. And number 5, we finally get some specificity of what close to even means, and it's 5%. So you need to have 5% from the average deviation as a max. You don't need to have it. You can't have more than 5%, I should say. These factors are generally referred to as the Gingell's factors test, and it's under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. And that's mostly ensuring that you do not undermine minority voting strength or detrimentally affect minority voting power. And again, that's all spelled out in much more detail in your report, but I think the summary does it for purposes of our presentation. So that's all the framework of beginning to solve it. And now we're going to dive into to map C more specificity. And I'm going to turn it over to Harold, please.
Good afternoon, all the persons, Mr. Mayor. I'm going to start pretty quick. On map C, as you can see, there were 4 sections that were moved. So those groups were moved on the map. But as Mr. Lippman said earlier, it passed the test for everything that we were looking for. So when we looked at the equal population, that was passed on here. The adjoining territories, as you look, they're all next to each other. And what we did, because the Ward 2 was overpopulated and Ward 7 was underpopulated, we had to make right there in that corner where the Bay Ridge Gardens is, we have taken that from Ward 6 and put it into Ward 7. So what that did, that had decreased the population in Ward 6. So we had to get populations from somewhere else. So we went to the north side of Tyler Avenue and by the Forest Drive corridor, and we had taken those blocks right there from Ward 5. And we also, in the Truston Heights area, we have moved it to Ward 6. So in doing that, the Truston Heights area was previously in Ward 1, so that decreased the population in Ward 1. Now, Ward 2 was overpopulated to get us to that variation. So we had taken that part in Germantown and moved it to Ward 1. So that brought us in the variation of 5%. We had to make sacrifices because we were looking at moving it around and we was looking at all angles of how we was going to make this work. So there are sacrifices that we made, and that was one, Bay Ridge Gardens going to Ward 7, and the other one was the Germantown area. What we tried not to do, we tried not to split communities that were of interest, and we pretty much did that. It's just that we had to make that sacrifice in Germantown. We looked at the Gingell's test, and doing this, we didn't violate Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So we were pretty intense. The last thing, one of the things I want to stress is that this map reflects the racial composite of the city of Annapolis. So in doing this, you have 5 wards that are predominantly white, 2 predominantly Hispanic, and 1 ward that is predominantly African American. So I really want to stress that the map reflects the city. And we did a lot, but that's the basis for map 3. As Mr. Lippman said, it wasn't a lot of moving around, but we tried a multitude of actions to try to get to where we were, and this is what we came up with Ward 1. With map C.
Thank you, Mr. Law. I appreciate the presentation.
Alderwoman Finlayson, just want to ask a question.
So is map C the one that you had a majority vote on
This is the majority opinion
Okay,
map.
okay, thank you.
Yep, it said 5 out of 9 votes.
Alderman O'Neill.
5 out of 9.
5 out of, okay,
Yep.
thank you.
And just to be clear, so Germantown Homewood now is in 3 wards,
In this map.
1, 2, and 3 in this map. And does anything that was previously in Ward 3 in Germantown Homewood change?
Sean could be my backup, but I don't think Ward 3 ended up changing. Ward 3 ended up not really being helpful or harmful in most of this discussion because it was not, you just got lucky.
Okay. Thank you.
Because we were trying to go from 2 to 7 and 3 is out of the way.
Looks like Carmen might have lost her campaign manager though.
Yeah.
All right, okay. Alderman Savage?
Can I ask a general question now, or do you want us to wait?
I mean-
Doesn't matter.
We were trying to get through this relatively fast to have general questions at the end.
That's fine.
But you're the boss, so. Yeah. All right.
Okay, continue, thank you.
Thank you. For the next map, 3C, Greg Brennan will introduce.
Hello, alderpersons. Good afternoon. So similar to map C, we flipped some population into Ward 7 and then had to make it up moving towards Ward 2. Besides the 3 draft maps that went to public comment and the 2 final maps, we really tried dozens of permutations. And these are the only ones even close to being acceptable. So based on public meeting feedback, brought to our attention several issues with the first drafts and made us discard maps B and C, maps A and B. We did go from there and make necessary corrections and to rectify the problems that were brought up during the public meeting. And then we attempted rebalancing them again to try and get the districts back in the right population balances. This version succeeds in keeping established communities in single districts and in preserving the racial plurality of all districts except District 6. Mr. Lippman has already brought up that even currently, even with the 2020 census, Ward 6 had moved into a plurality of Latino, and it's 40% Latino now with this change. Populations are all within 3% of the average, except Ward 1, which is a little lighter than that. It's at 3.3%. But pretty much everything else Harold said in his presentation applies to this map too.
Thank you, Mr. Brennan. Sorry.
Yeah, Alderman Savage?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm just curious, what's the small area that looks like a hook between 7 and 8?
Yeah.
Trying to look at the map, figure out what that is.
It's really a waterway that we moved to keep everything contiguous, I believe, but I can double check that. But it just is open water.
Oh, there are no homes there.
I don't believe so, but I'll double check that.
I'm taking your water, Ross. Wow.
Okay. If there's no other questions now, we'll move on to Marianne Arnett's presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone. Before I start my comments, I do want to mention, for those of you who don't know, that I happen to share parentage with Ross Arnett, but I'm really hoping you don't hold that against me. Okay, so I have the honor of discussing the 2 maps that we disregarded. Both of these maps satisfied all of the requirements that we talked about, except for one really important requirement, which was keeping communities of interest intact or not moving them so that they lost their voting advantages. Map A split the Clay Street neighborhood in half and divided it between Ward 2 and Ward 1, and moved Bay Ridge Gardens from Ward 6 to Ward 7. Map B, again, split Clay Street. And it's funny because on the maps, when we were doing this in our little bubble with the computer, for some reason that Clay Street neighborhood just looked like the perfect neighborhood to divide. But then when I went and drove it, there's no way you can divide that neighborhood. So it really was really important for all of us to be able to be familiar with and get in touch with these neighborhoods that we were shifting around. I can assure you we all did that. This was not something that we just did capriciously or arbitrarily. Map B also moved Harbor House from Ward 6 to Ward 8 and moved Robinwood from Ward 6 to Ward 5. And the committee, the task force felt very, very much that we needed to keep those voting blocks and that concentration in an area where it could be effective. So that's why we removed both maps A and B. Now, you clearly have them, and I suppose if you want to, you can still look at them, but they're not the best maps. So thank you.
Thank you, Marianne. We looked at and played with the various configurations in significant detail, and we're trying to give you a sense of some of the obstacles we ran into and why we think that the two best maps or the one over the other really should be the limits of your discussion. We know that you'll do whatever you want to do. But to give you a further sense of our efforts, I'd like to go to the next slide, please. 2E, and this is where I'm going to get to what we were trying to achieve with the 422 map.
So I think Alderman Gage just said something on the last point. I apologize.
Yeah, thank you so much. I was trying to see if I could follow along with the presentation. You mentioned map B. I wasn't sure what B you were saying. You said it took away Robinwood and Eastport Terrace from Ward 6?
Yes, I believe so, although I'll be very honest, I've looked at these maps and we did this work a while ago. When I reviewed it, it looked like we had Robinwood move from Ward 6 back to Ward 5 in map B.
Not recommended.
Okay, so
You missed the first two.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Yeah. Marianne was just going over the maps that we discarded, and she was explaining why we discarded it. So moving on to 2E. So we were trying to see if it was possible to get to more perfect distribution ethnically and racially. As I mentioned earlier, the population of Annapolis, according to the 2020 census, was roughly 50% Caucasian, 25%, and I'm rounding, 25% Black and 25% Hispanic. With the number of wards that we have, that would match perfectly if you had 4 wards that were majority white and 2 that were majority Black and 2 that were majority Hispanic. And so that's what we refer to as 422. And so we spent a lot of hours trying to get to a map that reflected 422. And essentially this is the closest that we came up with. And it still doesn't even achieve that goal. It gets close though. And you could see how it certainly is not compact. You don't get a nice, neat boundaries around wards like you do in some of the two maps that had the most votes. So it's not compact. It does, if you look at when you get the report, you'll see it does get you close to that 422. And again, that doesn't have to be an ideal, but it does end up with 2 wards, this map that you're looking at, it ends up with 2 wards that are African-American majority or plurality, which the 2 other maps that we discussed, C and 3C, do not have. So again, it's close, but not possible after our work to get to a 4-2-2 distribution of wards. You end up with wards that are not compact, and you end up with, I forgot to mention one other point. A main difficulty of trying to achieve that 4-2-2 distribution is, within our city, a lot of the population of the African Americans and Hispanics live in the same communities. So it wasn't as if you could disentangle for purposes of trying to get more voting power to those two groups. And so that was one of the biggest obstacles. If you looked at the population distribution of where people actually live, those two groups tend to live in a lot of similar communities. And so that's why we couldn't do better than having 5 wards having a majority Caucasian. So those are all the maps we wanted to show you. Everything is in a lot more detail in the report. If we can go into the last slide, please, just to give you a sense of a little bit of indication of our work. We had 2 public meetings. Like I said, we had 7 meetings among the task force members. Each of us, or many of us, I should say, met with Sean individually to come up with to work with the computer and try to come up with different maps. We had 16 different maps configurations that we brought to the table to discuss, and then discarded all of the others that we didn't present. And we had involved a lot of people. We had representatives throughout the entire city, and we got input, I believe, from each of you as well, and certainly many constituents in each of your wards. So we tried to go through this briefly. I'm sorry that you didn't have this report handy to go through while we had our presentation. Like I said, I think you did have it back in April, but it would have been handy to have it more recently. And hopefully you'll get that soon. I'm sorry you didn't have the maps during the presentation. So with those caveats, what questions do you have for us?
Alderman Pindell-Charles.
Thank you so much, committee and chair. You've done a magnanimous job, and it wasn't easy, I know, and going through all of this, but it was necessary, and we thank you for that, number one. Number two, I want to just speak just briefly. This past summer, back in June, we had a Hispanic town hall at Walt S. Mills Parole Elementary, and Laura and I worked on that together. We had a good turnout. We've talked about doing it even possibly citywide or either ward-wide or something like that. So we've had some discussions about that. Laura had her Hispanic virtual town hall last week. I think it was about at least 75 to 100 people on there. And one of the things that I brought up, based on personal experience, just being in Ward 3, we've had some challenges between the communities. And so I think they're going to have 4 things they're going to pursue, but one of the things that I strongly encouraged was to have more interaction, say on the Greater Parole Community Association actually having Latino representation and those kinds of things. I have 2 personal stories, I'm not going to get into it, where the dynamics were one thing, and after that there was a dialogue and some interaction, and it turned the tables tremendously. So that was something I was bringing to the table. They talked about entrepreneurship, businesses, all kinds of issues, but that issue was not brought up, and I thought that was critical to talk about those communities that need to be, for lack of a better word, friendlier to one another, because I've seen it up close and personal, and it's happened to me. So my thought was that would help tremendously. If we can't necessarily get the actual representation of the lines, there is a way of doing that. That's number one. And number two, and you indicated, you talked to Ms. Raftovich, at some point down the road, this may impact representation on our boards and commissions, because some of them are by ward. So I don't know, I'm not asking you to answer that question now, but that's a question that needs to be, I guess, talked about, or at least thrown around or something, because that's maybe an issue. I know there's very little movement in your maps, but still it may affect not necessarily the council, but representation on boards and commissions that require one to live in that ward.
It's an interesting question. We purposefully did not consider where people currently live as far as elected officials, and we certainly didn't discuss volunteers for boards and commissions, because this map wouldn't go into effect until the next election. And even if it went into effect sooner, which it doesn't, we offer this as what's best for the city overall without, with being blind towards, on an individual basis, how it might affect an individual as far as a representative.
Thank you all again.
Thank you.
Alderman Guy was next.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it, Mr. Mayor. I'm trying to pull up the maps that are approved. But I do have concern as it relates to, awesome, thank you.
That's the majority.
If I could see. I do have concerns though as it relates to the isolation of wards based off of race. I understand the need to have predominantly minority communities, but the problem with that is that then you have an unbalanced council where 2 people have black wards and everybody else has a predominantly white ward. And things don't get passed easy that way in the budget. Things don't get understood that way as it relates to community relations, policing, environment, anything. And so how can you, even with the existing map, I know there's mover of Bay Ridge to 7 and stuff, but how can you spread out the communities evenly, the African American and Hispanic communities, so that there is an equal reflection on the council? Because even currently, even though we do have 3 minorities on the council, is not an equal representation of our city. And so I understand the need to have the historic minority districts, but how do you balance it out so that there is equal voting rights amongst the council?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I will partly answer it of some of that is above this task force's pay grade, if you will. The goal of the maps isn't necessarily to ensure that we have the best candidates to represent all the people in the ward. And some of that will be left to the candidates themselves to represent each of their all of the constituents of their communities. Regardless of how the lines are drawn, that's going to be the case. You could have, no matter who you have in what ward, you need good representatives. It always, like anything, comes down to the people. No, I don't think so. I don't think it's going to be specific about the map. The other interesting thing, interesting to us, because we discussed it, because some people raise, well, it's a shame that you have to consider race in these maps. Can't you just draw the maps based on what's either most compact or what's most logical in other ways? Obviously, other people have differing views, but the law requires us to consider race. When you look at the Jingles test, I'm never quite sure how to pronounce it. I'm going to call it the Jingles factors test. You have to consider race. And so it's a balance. Are you benefiting the minority races by making sure they at least have 1 or 2 votes? Or are you benefiting those races by making sure that they're in parts of every community? And so every representative has a minority population. And you can make an argument on either way for which is better. Ultimately, we were more leaning towards, let's try to make sure at least as many wards as possible have the possibility to elect someone from the minority communities. And so that's where we're trying to get to 2 and 2, 2 Hispanic and 2 Black. And like I said, we couldn't get there. We tried really hard to get there. It just wasn't possible based on where people live. And you can't go around, and you have to have contiguity.
Are there rules on, because when I look at congressional maps or even the state maps, I mean, they gerrymander it to fit a specific need. And so is that not possible within the city? Because I think even the example that I was glad was thrown out is that if you were to separate Clay Street by 1 and 2, obviously there are not enough Black people on either the lower half or the upper half of Clay Street that if you were to put the upper half of Clay Street into Ward 1, they would essentially have no voice. And I'm thinking the same thing even with 7, for example. If you take out Bay Ridge Gardens and put it in 7, that's essentially the only predominantly Black community out of 4,500 votes, which means that when it comes to priority, not to say that my colleague from Ward 7 would, but when it comes to priority, they would be less of the priority. Same with if you moved Robinwood to 5, they would literally be the only Black community in Ward 5.
Not quite, but close.
Well, Annapolis Neck. I don't know if any others. But so how does that balance take place? And so that, and are you able to manipulate the lines in such in ways that we've seen previously.
So, two answers to your question. First, if, you might have missed when we were discussing the legal parameters, and I won't try to comment congressional maps, 'cause we didn't become experts in that. On city law, you do need compactness. So that's one answer. You do need to have compact wards, and within, among other standards and factors. But to more substantively answer your question, we came at each of these maps from various approaches. One was, how do I move the fewest number of people? How do I alter the fewest communities possible? If you look up at this map, 2E, and if you look at it in more detail, when you look at the report, look at 2D and 2E both. I came at these maps of, not from that, as a blank slate. If we had a completely blank slate, and we started with trying to create 2 wards that were majority African American and 2 wards that are majority Hispanic, could we do it? And this was as close as we could get. And you can see it's a bit stretched. It's not compact. I mean, and it's, I think it did meet the parameters of being 5%, but it ultimately did not meet the goal of getting to 2 and 2 of 2 African American and 2 Hispanic. And so it's close to it, and it would get you as close as I think is conceivable. But this was to try to achieve what you just described. The reason why it was impossible, because if you try to, say, draw circles around all the minority votes that you're trying to get to, even if it's not compact, it at least has to touch. You have to have it has to be contiguous. And in order to connect one population of African Americans there and another one here, you need something to connect. And in every case, that something in between was white population. And so when you try to add a black population there and a black population there to try to get to that 422, you ended up with white neighborhoods in between. And so it just, no matter how distorted you were willing to go, and this was as distorted as I think you could imagine, this was as close as we can get.
So the bulk of the minority population you would say is center city.
I don't necessarily would say center. It was certainly overlap. So Ward 3 certainly has, I wouldn't call Ward 3 center city, but there was a lot of population, minority population in Ward 3. Same thing along Hilltop. You have a lot of both African Americans and Hispanics, maybe even more Hispanics. The pockets of where there was strong African American communities, say like Bloomsbury Square, Harbor House, around the city, they're little like islands, and when it comes down to the blocks, and like I said, when you try to connect those islands, you run into white population communities. So yeah, I mean, I think this is the closest to, let's start at the blank slate and start with building just the 4 minority wards, 2 and 2. And this is what we ended up with.
We started with a blank map.
We literally started with a blank map, no ward lines. Where are the minority populations, and let's try to connect them.
Okay.
Thank you, Alderman Savage.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you to the commission. I know this is a significant amount of work, and just it looks like you went through a number of scenarios. So thank you for that. So a couple questions. First, it was really, I think the alderman, my colleague from Ward 6, really hit on some of the points I wanted to, and I, as far as I was going to ask about federal requirements, and it sounds like federal requirements aren't exactly crystal clear. So you have to consider various things. I'm guessing the city code is just as ambiguous as far as keeping things compact, right? How do you define that? So I could certainly see it's quite a balance. And, I think when I first started thinking about this, I was more inclined to push for community connectivity. But I completely acknowledge I'm coming from a point of white privilege, and that may have most likely influences, intentionally or not, my perspective. But I do see, so that's where I come from. I can see it's more of a balance, right? I think as far as having the one assumption, I think, which I understand the federal government wants us to emphasize this, and I do think it's important, but I do think, at least locally, I think we do a really good job of representing all of our constituents, no matter their ethnicity. And I think even in the city, right, we have a colleague from Ward 3 got elected in what is predominantly Hispanic ward. and then we have our former colleague, Alderman Rodriguez, who was elected first Hispanic and was presumably predominantly white Ward 5. So I think that shows how, and maybe we're fortunate being in Annapolis. I think we have some really, I think, just smart populists who wants to be deliberate with how they vote and want to be representative and elect truly, I think, the people who best represent them. And I think even with Ward 2, we know that our colleague and also former colleague, Alderman Payon, paid a lot of attention to High Street and the old ward, that part of the city. So I think we're fortunate, but it sounds like, just from based on the whole conversation, it sounds like you're well aware of that balancing effect between keeping things contiguous with the community, but also keeping in mind some of the racial, trying to keep that racial aspect in mind. Like my colleague said for Ward 7, it's a unique ward. We have some I'd love to see the demographics, I think, of various communities in my ward. I think Victor Haven's probably predominantly African-American, but also probably pretty well mixed. Hyde Park down at the end of Edgewood Road, I think, is probably pretty mixed as well as some of the multifamily housing. But so if you have any other current thoughts, any thoughts you want to offer on that, certainly feel free. I have another question, though, but is there anything else you want to add on that balancing act?
So just two quick responses. As far as you mentioned, like city code, the legal requirements come from the Voting Rights Act and then court's interpretation. The Jingles test, that was from a court case. Okay. So that's the guiding principles is from federal legislation. To answer your second point, globally, map C, the majority map from this task force, Ward 7 would have almost exact match of the entire city. So 50% Caucasian, 22% African American, and 21% Hispanic. And again, I'm looking at the demographics that I think you'll enjoy diving into. I'm on page 33 of the report. And then sort of you touched on something from Alderman Gay. I want to come back to that map 2E, and like I said, it's partner 2D. Are the only two ways that we came up with having two wards, not majority, but plurality African American. And that's, like I said, that you have to work that hard to get to not even a majority, but at least a plurality of African Americans. And if you do that, then you only end up with one ward that has a plurality of Hispanics. So it's still only 3 wards that we're talking about that could be minority more than any other, either plurality or majority.
Yeah. Yeah, and on the Bay Ridge point, I see both maps would have that community be added to Ward 7. And to my colleague's point, I do think, that would force myself or my predecessor, whoever is going to be in this seat, to do their best to reach out to the community, to hear their voice. And maybe this is a separate conversation, but I think it's a separate question about how to most effectively engage such communities, right? Because I've tried to do so in some of the existing enclaves of various ethnicities in my ward, and it hasn't always been successful, right? Especially I know a white guy coming through a neighborhood, they don't always answer the door. So that, I think, is maybe a separate conversation, but might benefit all of us. But my last question, I guess, could you just highlight again, so we can have it in mind, again, just the difference, not just the physical difference between C and CA, I think it is, but
3C.
What was the driver behind those differences, though? What caused those?
I want to answer your question, but Sean wanted to also add something.
Okay.
I'm going to have her answer, and then I'll answer your question.
I did put together a public-facing interactive map that lets you look at all the blocks and the breakdown. So I'll reshare that with the council so that if you're interested in see the current makeup.
I'm just reminded that there are municipalities that have at-large members of the council, and that might be a way that other municipalities address the problem of having a specific community that wants to be served, but it's so spread out, there's no way you could put it in one block so that one person could represent them in a contiguous geographical way.
You asked the main difference between C and 3C. Those are the two
Yes.
maps that we ultimately voted on. The main difference, so C, we're looking at C now. C breaks up Germantown more so than the next one does. It does not break off Bates and Ward 4. And so that's a pretty significant change. It also, this map does not split up the Hilltop community, Hispanic community, between 5 and 6 like you'll see on the next map. So I would refer to this as it moves the fewer number of people between the two maps, but it's less compact. And it chooses to split up probably a predominantly white area in Germantown rather than an African-American area in Bates. So if we flip to 3C, you'll see what I'm talking about. It's a little bit more compact. It does split off Bates from 4 and moves it to Ward 1. It has a more logical split of Germantown by using West Street as the dividing line. But you'll see that middle area between 5 and 6 where Hilltop is, it splits a community possibly there. So that's ultimately those are the choices. It's either do you split Germantown or do you split Bates, and we ended up, the majority thought we should choose the community that did not split up the African-American community.
Can I ask the minority opinion why they decided to do 3C over just C?
Yes, I want to speak to that. When we had this vote, it was a really, really tough vote. We had a lot of discussion between those two maps, the majority map C and this map 3C. And it really came down to I think, or at least for me, I'll speak for me, to which community are we going to split? Historically, which community has suffered the slings and arrows, shall we say? And I voted for the majority map mainly because I felt like it was really important to keep those minority communities intact. And that is where the basic difference is because a community or a couple of communities were going to get split. Which ones do we split?
Thank you.
Yep, I think we decided we definitely were not going to split Clay Street. And I mentioned from the beginning that you had to pick among the 5, at least one, I think at least 2 of the 5 were going to get split between either Clay Street, Truxton Heights, Bates, Bay Ridge Gardens, and then Harbor House, Eastport Terrace. So you can see Bay Ridge Gardens in almost every scenario got split. It was either that one or Harbor House and to Eastport Terrace. And if we felt like splitting up Eastport Terrace from Harbor House didn't make sense, so if we had to make a decision, we'd rather keep that intact and split off Bay Ridge Gardens. And again, you need border communities. Truxton Heights, the most important was that they not get split up at all, but they also pointed out that essentially in every version of this task force for like the past 40, 50 years, they've changed wards every time. I didn't try to verify that statement, but being right in the middle of the city, you could see how that could happen, just depending on, they have to move to one ward or another. Defending this map, I'd say if you didn't look at the populations, it's a cleaner map. It's more compact, it makes more sense. But of course, you can't turn a blind eye to the populations. People live where they live, and communities have suffered the injustices that they've suffered. And so it makes sense. It's a rational argument. You could rationalize either one. I think they're both rational, reasonable maps. It's just ultimately which are more important to you.
Thank you.
I think also important, and of course you have an attorney to ask, but I think both maps would pass the Jingles test as we understood it. And they're within the 5%, so they're both legally permissible, just it requires a judgment.
Alderman Pendle Charles and
Thank you, Mr.
Alderman
Mayor.
Finlayson of the.
One thing I want to point out, Oxford Landing has 9 streets, and Alderwoman Finlayson and I jointly represent them. And one very nice person, or a very prominent person in that community, always says they have two older persons. So there is a benefit. But I'm gonna say the same thing about even maybe Homewood, Germantown. We work together. But I'll bring up an interesting point that Alderman Savage brought up about, say, Bay Ridge Gardens, and maybe getting more insight, and I'm just going to use them because they're sitting in the chairs, from Alderman Gay as to how best maybe to represent the residents in Bay Ridge Gardens. And I think that makes us better alder people when we're, I'm not going to say forced, but we're able to ask the question when we might need some help or some support. And I think that's extremely something that really needs to be pointed out. And those are two perfect examples right there. And the same would go for Alderwoman O'Neill and Tierney and I, if Germantown and Homewood were split up. We're already working on a couple of projects. The Hawk Beacon light in front of the library, which is definitely her ward, but of course it impacts mine. So we're already doing a lot of cross-pollination, and that to me is a good thing. So thank you.
Finlayson?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I want to reiterate that there was one map that got a majority of vote. Am I correct?
Yes, C.
And that was C. So maybe this was answered, but why the need? Traditionally, we have gotten one map from the committee, one recommendation. I think this causes a bit of confusion by sharing all of the maps with us. But why a minority report?
We felt it was important for you to understand our thought process and then ultimately where we landed as well. And that's why we're being transparent. And so it's just a matter of being transparent. You have the maps that we discarded or even didn't bring to a vote. 2E that I discussed, we didn't even bring that to a vote. We thought that wasn't worthwhile. A and B, we discarded for the reasons we described. And then ultimately we landed on two maps and we just want to be transparent. We're being transparent on which one has our majority support. And if that's the one you want to base your legislation on, that's perfectly reasonable, it's supported, but it doesn't have to be the only decision.
I think I just heard you describe 3C as the best. What you call C as convoluted or something like that.
C is the most, 3C is the most compact. And so if you don't have the demographics in front of you, C versus 3C, this is more compact than the other ones. It's closer to having circles around the wards. Not a perfect circle, of course, around any of them. But you do have the statistical information. And so that's where we get into, well, compact C, let's go back to C, is not quite as compact. It's a bit more stretched. You still have Bates having that hook in 4, and you still have other little hooks, but it's still legally, and as we think it still passes the Jingles test as being legally permissible, and it does reflect the population differences that we described.
And it did get the majority of vote from the people who investigated this far greater than we will understand. So I want to thank all of you for doing that. I know this, I've sat through this a couple of times now, and it is not an easy task. So thank you. I have been sitting here, not distracted by emails, but trying to find the email that was sent in April, you said, with all of these diagrams, and I could not find it. So I would appreciate you sending everything again to us, but particularly highlighting the map that received the majority of votes from the committee.
I'm going to have to rely on city staff for that, but I'm sure they hear you loud and clear.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alderman Net.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. As one who is relatively unscathed by this process, I will tell you that I've watched it from afar. I understand the level of effort and toil that went into this, and I just want to offer my appreciation to all of you. I think you did your due diligence, and we're moving about 250 people, but we burnt about 50 gallons of effort to do it. So thank you.
Thank you, Alderman Savage and Alderman Gay. Oh, sorry, Alderman Gay.
Thank you. I did just have one last question because I can't really see. Was there any consideration taken into, for example, Ward 6, we have 0 economic hubs. We don't have a grocery center. We don't have shopping center. We really don't have anything outside of the former Annapolis Seafood Shop. Was there any consideration to, we have the Eastport Shopping Center directly across the street from us where we actively engage where we actively participate and support those businesses, but we have no voice in that. It's all up to Ward 8. Similarly, with, it looks like on the backside, the removal of Truxton Park, which would have been our potential for recreational access. Was that taken into consideration as well?
So no is the short and sweet answer, but I'll also say I don't think we're allowed to. This is a summary, but you'll see this in more depth. You don't need to strain yourself to read it if it's hard from your angle. This is in the report with 4 pages before it, just leading up and describing it. But there's nothing in here that we would have thought interpreted as to allow us to consider those sort of factors.
Is this the jingle?
The last part is, so you get to number 6, satisfy the jingles factors test. So it's all about minority voting power and looking at where people live in terms of voting power. There's nothing in here that talks about the kind of access that you're talking about.
Not even on the level of like property values?
Nothing. Yeah. So I don't think we would have been allowed to consider that, nor do I think it's appropriate for you to, frankly. Not speaking as your lawyer, of course.
Alderman Pendle-Charles and Alderman Finlayson.
Thank you. I think regarding the minority report or the dissenting opinion, I think you're channeling into your inner law background.
Trying to be transparent.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alderman Finlayson.
Yes, one last question. You indicated that you didn't take into consideration future development. Ward 4 traditionally has been the largest ward. And even after redistricting, the growth continues and it's the largest ward again. And we know already that there is a development already approved from 2006, but nevertheless is coming into play now and will increase the population, 100 or more people. We already know that. So why wouldn't we take in some consideration for those things that we know are coming? And is the assumption that people will move from elsewhere in the city, but that which will still free up housing in other parts of the city? So
as we understood the standards, we could not consider future development and movement for purposes of counting and getting to under 5%. You have to be plus or minus 5% deviation. But once you're within 5% plus or minus, you absolutely could consider where you expect there to be future development. Comparing the 2 maps that we're mostly talking about, C and 3C, Ward 4, to use that example, Ward 4 ends up with being plus 3.5% above average. And I'm on page 33 of the report when you get it. Again, it's that demographic section. I know, you don't have it, but make a note, you'll want to look at the demographics. This is on page 33. 3C actually has Ward 4 ending up at minus 3.0%. It's a little tiny, so I got to squint.
It's because you took Bates out of the ward. Really?
Exactly. So if you're anticipating more people in Ward 4, for instance, you might choose 3C because you start with less than the average at 3.5% or less than 3.0%, knowing you're quickly going to fill up and get closer to the average whenever those new developments are full.
Well, I was using Ward 4 as the perfect example because it's mine, but there are other developments going on in other areas of the city, so it's not unique to Ward 4. So we'll see it elsewhere.
Yep.
That was really a very, very frustrating part for us because we know this is coming. We know where the developments are, and we spent a lot of time with Eric Lashinsky talking about that, but we literally could not do it. We had to deal with real numbers, and it's frustrating.
Thank you.
Alderman Savage.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, just on that point, I'm assuming in the report there's a table of all the different, because I'd like to see the numbers as proposed in C and 3C, because to my colleague's point, Parkside Preserve in my ward, that's I think about 130 homes. So you're talking about 200 and whatever 60 new people, presumably, if it's about 2 in each home, right? I'm sorry, 300. So that's just, I guess my question would be, is there any ward under those two maps that is so close to that 5% that it might be an issue?
We didn't try to balance that because every ward has future development. And as Eric pointed out a number of times, a certain development might look like it's close and might still take another 10 years to get developed. So we didn't spend too much time thinking about the specific numbers or the timing of any one development. In your particular case that you raised, Ward 7 is plus 2.5% in both of the main maps, C and 3C. So you're starting at plus 2.5. To also try to make the math a little simpler, 1% is 400 people. So if you're talking about 300 people coming in, you're going to increase by 3/4 of 1%. So again, just to help with the math, that's 400 people is 1%.
Alderman Gay, and then Alderman O'Neill.
No, just quickly, I lied. Obviously, we have True Value in my ward, so we do have.
Thank you.
Yes.
I think I was conflicted. I was conflicted of raising that earlier, but.
I'm sitting here like, oh,
yeah.
Alderman O'Neill.
So just to clarify, if whatever the council decides, and I don't know when that vote comes up, an upcoming meeting, I'm guessing, it goes into effect in 2025, after Election Day?
No, it's for that election. So so to explain the process as I understand it, and again, I'm sure you'll refer to your city attorney, once what the city attorney's office is going to want you to do is sort of build a consensus towards one of these two maps, or maybe something different in theory, but presumably one of these two maps. Because ultimately their legislation is that very fine, long detail about moving from this point to this point. It's a very long bit. But it'll be an ordinance, I believe it's an ordinance that you're raising to approve a new ward map. And in that ordinance, it'll say effective for that election date. So as you start campaigning for the next term, you'll be looking at that new map and telling people, oh, you used to vote in this ward, now you're in my ward, or now you used to be in mine, now you're in their ward for this next election.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Any other questions? Well, a huge thank you for the thankless work that you've just done. We know it's not easy, and you cannot always keep everybody happy, but we think you've done an excellent job to give us these options to move forward on. And again, we big round of applause for your efforts. Thank you so much.
Appreciate it. I will say it's one of those tasks that I find interesting, and I thought it was going to be easier than it was, because once you got into all of the blocks and all of some of the practical things that kept you from moving what would seem so logical, it would be so much easier. So to that point, though, if you could put pressure on the designers of those blocks to change some of them, I encourage you to do that. I believe Sean was here 10 years ago and applied some of that pressure, and we didn't get any changes. So you might want to try to apply that pressure again, because it just kept you from doing things you'd want to do, I think.
For instance, sorry, who is that puts the blocks together?
It's the Census Bureau, but at some point, I want to say it's probably going to be 2025, 2026, they start seeking input. There are rules for where the blocks can break. That's why kind of Hunt Meadow and stuff, they're just huge, because there aren't natural breaks or street intersections. But we can apply and say, this is why we want them to break in different spots due to the size alone. So we have to work with the county's planning and zoning And I think we got 1 or 2 of the bigger ones out by 3 and 4 split somewhat, but it would probably help to have more input on why.
As an example, my neighborhood of Colony Hills in Eastport, in Dewan's district, is in the middle of another block, like a donut. It's unfathomable how some of these were chosen.
And lastly, I want to say, although this was a very challenging task, I think you all had good representatives from each of your wards. So I applaud you for picking such a diverse group of people. It was absolutely necessary and helpful to have all the input we had from different parts of the city. And so you had a really good task force. All the members that are here were really valuable, including the ones that were not here.
Thank you. Alderman Pendle Charles.
Thank you. I'd like to thank Lisa Randall Wilson for representing Ward 3. But speaking of unfathomable, in Ward 3, where Walgreens is, north-south split, the eastern part of Walgreens is in the city, and the western part of Walgreens is in the county of the store itself.
It's like the Lighthouse Shelter.
I think that is, but the building behind it is in the county, yeah. So, yes.
So I apologize you haven't had the report ahead of time, but I thank you for your attention today. And I'm sure we're all available once you get further into the report. If you want us back for whatever, just let us know.
Again, a big thank you. Truly appreciate you guys. Thank you. Mr. City Attorney, Acting City Attorney, anything else?
The agenda's been completed.
Okay, thank you. Is there anything else for the good of the order? Anybody? All right, hearing nothing, meeting adjourned.